The title of this presentation is The American Reformation Platform, a Political Action Plan for 2012. Before I begin this presentation, I want to take a second to introduce myself. My name is Larry Ballard. I'm a speaker and author of two books, Modern Slavery and the Fight for Freedom, and The Economic Tribulation, How to Survive and Prosper. Modern Slavery and the Fight for Freedom is the story of how the U.S. is being intentionally driven into economic collapse, but fortunately it also contains a complete political platform entitled The American Reformation Platform. The Economic Tribulation, How to Survive and Prosper is the study of the Great Depression, and it gives readers insights as to how to invest in a downturn economic environment. The American Reformation Platform is a comprehensive political platform consisting of 8 major planks. If implemented in its entirety, it has the capability of restoring the United States to its greatness. The mission statement of the American Reformation Platform is based on common sense solutions that are straightforward and easy to understand, and on reinstating key pieces of legislation which have been systematically repealed in order to allow special interest groups to seize control of the federal government. The 8 planks of the platform are 1. Election reform, 2. Trade reform, 3. Finance reform, 4. Energy reform, 5. Health care reform, 6. Immigration reform, 7. Welfare reform, and 8. Education reform. But before we get into the details of the platform, I feel it's necessary to go over what some of the problems are that are causing us to have the American Reformation Platform put into place in the first place. The Constitution is the protector of our freedom, but unfortunately, for decades there have been men in power who have sought to undermine the Constitution because they felt it stood in their way of personal gain and their personal political agendas. One such individual was Franklin Roosevelt, who was reputed to be close friends with Joe Stalin, the Russian leader. In the cartoon down below it says, "I am glad you dug up your Constitution, Joe. I couldn't find ours," reflecting the opinion at the time that Roosevelt was anti-Constitution. In more modern times, George W. Bush said in the White House Blues, "The Constitution is just a God-blank piece of paper." And Henry Kissinger said, "The illegal we do immediately, the unconstitutional takes a little longer." The Constitution reflects the wisdom of our founding fathers. Their wisdom came from personal experience. They had lived under the monarchies of Europe. They had lived under the free trade system. They had lived under conditions similar to what we're now facing in the United States. And through those hardships, they had learned. And they took the wisdom that they learned and embedded it in the Constitution. And that is why it has stood for 200 years as the protector of our freedom. And with that in mind, our freedom is now at risk. I want to quote Thomas Jefferson: "The democracy will cease to exist when you take away from those who are willing to work and give to those who will not." Or in other words, the current policies of redistribution of wealth, the current efforts to drive the United States into economic collapse are threatening the democracy. On a more current vein, I'd like to quote Senator Barry Goldwater: "Remember that a government big enough to give you everything that you want is also big enough to take away everything you have." So the question is, how does a government take away everything the people have? In the context of what Thomas Jefferson was saying, I think President Obama's policies of redistribution of wealth are an excellent example. What his policies are effectively doing is taking away from the most productive members of society and giving to the least productive members of society. Over time, the outcome can only be financial collapse. But fortunately, there is a better alternative. We can redistribute the wealth from the financial elite who control more than 95% of the world's wealth and give it to all 3 classes, to the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. Once we've accomplished this, we would have enough financial capital to reinvigorate the manufacturing segment of the United States of America and put the United States back on the right track. In my book, Modern Slavery and the Fight for Freedom, I delineate exactly how to do that. One of the planks of the American Reformation Platform delineates in detail how we redistribute the wealth from the financial elite to all 3 classes. This slide is by no means a representation of a comprehensive political platform, but it does, however, give us a basic understanding of what we, the American people, need to assist on if we hope to reverse the debt crisis. The first thing we need to do is to emphatically stop practicing intentionally losing trade. And what that means is we need to withdraw from the World Trade Organization, withdraw from NAFTA, withdraw from all free trade agreements, and insist on replacing them with fair trade agreements. We also need to make sure that we send the signal to our legislators that say we want no part of participation in the AmeriUnion. For those of you who are not familiar with what that is, it is an effort to combine the United States of America, Mexico, and Canada into one super trading group. The second thing we need to do is end unfunded entitlement programs, including benefits to illegal aliens. And the third thing we need to do is end U.S. imperialism and wars for profit. We haven't discussed anything about wars in this slide presentation, and I'm not really going to get into it now, except to say that wars are incredibly, incredibly profitable, and they are a tool for political manipulation on a global level. I have a presentation on the web, and I have a chapter in my book that discusses wars for profit. It's something that the American people need to be informed of, but now is really not the time or place to get into details. Our government leaders are not inept. If our leaders were inept, things would occasionally work out in our favor, in favor of the American public. But they always work out in favor of the banks, the corporations, the special interest groups, and the politicians. No, the collapse of the U.S. economy is intentional, as depicted by the graphs below. The purple graph below depicts the growing U.S. trade deficit, and it is correlated with the red graph next to it, which reflects the increase in national debt. And the green graph next to that depicts the massive amount of printing that the Fed is doing, which is driving us into hyperinflation, which is reflected in the cartoon next to it, which is from my book, was a depiction of the collapse of the Weimar Republic in Germany when it took an entire wheelbarrow full of money to buy a single loaf of bread. So what's the outcome of such an economic collapse? Invariably, in troubled times, the uninformed masses are always drawn to charismatic radicals with devastating consequences. That, folks, is how the likes of Lenin and Hitler and Stalin and Mao are almost always brought into power. This collage is my effort to explain the plan to collapse America and drive it into a one-world dictatorship. A superpower like the United States is not easily defeated in war, so the best way to overthrow a great nation like the United States is to drive it into economic collapse. And to do that, it is essential that you get control of the issuance of currency. So that is precisely why in 1913 the Federal Reserve was established. The Federal Reserve is a consortium of private international bankers. They took us off of the gold standard. They were given control of the supply of money and the interest rates that were charged on that money. And that gave them control of all of the U.S. economy. They are able to control Wall Street and real estate. They were able to determine boom-bust cycles. They were able to buy influence in Washington and the major corporations. They've driven us into a welfare state. They've seen to it that our politicians have massive deficit spending. They've driven us into wars that have driven us into debt. They've used the power of unions in order to further economically collapse us by setting up pension funds that were absolutely unfunded, and by using community organization groups such as ACORN to bring into power the people that they wanted. They use issues like illegal immigration in order to give entitlements to those people in order to further drive us into collapse. And most dangerously, in terms of the economic freefall, they entered us into the free trade agreements with China and with NAFTA and with the World Trade Organization, and a cause of massive trade deficits, which have resulted in the $14 trillion national debt that we face. And then, as we got into severe economic problems, and they should have lowered taxes, what did they do? They raised them. Then what did they do? They implemented the stimulus in order to drive us into massive, massive debt. So, that said, the following is what you have to do on a political basis. You have to buy influence. You have to basically be able to have influence in White House, influence in the Congress, influence in our courts. You have to be able to take over the media and control it so that it says what you want it to say. And then you have to undermine the Constitution. You have to take over the educational system. You have to degrade the religion and the morality of the people so they will accept the things that you are forcing on them. And then, once you've done all of those things, you are finally ready for the takeover. And how do you take over? You take over by taking control of all of the things that determine a person's ability to literally live or die. You take over gas and food and energy and water and health care. And you have a bill such as the Patriot Act, which makes it possible for you to, at your will, define a national emergency, declare martial law, and move into a dictatorship. And that, folks, is exactly what is happening to America. We are well on our way to our crisis that will one day lead us into martial law, and we will probably never emerge because we will be forced into the one world government that will invariably be a hybrid capitalist communist dictatorship. This slide is somewhat redundant, but I want to drive home a very important point, and that is that our government pits us against each other as a means of political control. We need to wake up and understand that if we allow them to divide us, we are truly going to be in trouble. Our government is pitting us against each other through the issues of immigration, through the welfare state, through the cost of gas and food and energy and water, and through availability to health care. So what is the answer? We need to become more self-sufficient. Every American, in light of the crisis that is looming, should have 6 months to a year's worth of food. You should buy bulk food. You should have a water purification system. You should have a solar cooking system so that you can be self-sufficient. You should try to pay your debts off and get debt-free and be in a position where you're not dependent on the government so they can control you by controlling access to the things that determine whether you live or whether you die. I know many people believe that it is over, that the collapse of the United States is imminent, that we are imminently going to move into the one world order. But I don't believe it has to be that way. I believe the fate of the world is in the hands of the American citizens, and I believe we can prevent the one world government from forming. I'm going to read from Henry Kissinger. The New World Order cannot happen without U.S. participation, as we are the most significant single component. What he's referring to here is that we are certainly, if not the, one of the world's largest economic superpowers, but we're also one of the largest military forces in the world. And if we were to wake up as a nation and oppose formation of the one